My name is Rashid. I say that now, but in those first moments after the sentence, my own name felt like it belonged to someone else. The judge uttered the words, "Death by execution," and the sound echoed in the makeshift courtroom, but it didn't seem to connect to me. I felt as if I were floating, watching a man who looked like me, dressed in dirty prison clothes, being condemned. As they dragged me back to the underground cell, the shock began to dissipate, replaced by a cold that didn't come from the dampness of the stone walls. It was an internal cold, an ice spreading through my veins, freezing my thoughts. 7 days. They gave me 7 days. The cell had no window, only a bare bulb in the hallway that cast a pale light through the bars, creating shadows that danced like specters. The smell was a mixture of mold, filth, and human despair, an odor that stuck to the back of your throat and refused to leave. I sat on the stone floor, the cold seeping up through my body, and tried to understand. 7 days. In 7 days, I would cease to exist. Before we continue, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, activate the bell so you don't miss any testimony, and leave a comment telling us where you're listening from. It's very important to have you participating in this community. Now, let's get back to the testimony. That first night, terror consumed me completely. It wasn't a noble or silent fear, but a raw, animalistic agony. I curled up in the darkest corner of the cell, shaking uncontrollably, not from the cold, but from an internal convulsion that racked my soul. The tears came, hot and bitter, streaming down my dirty face until there was nothing left to cry, only dry, silent sobs that tore at my chest. I prayed, but my prayers were screams of anger at God. Where was He? Why had He brought me here, made me a shepherd of His small, hidden flock, only to abandon me to this end? I wrestled with Him in the darkness, as Jacob wrestled with the angel, demanding an answer, an explanation, anything other than the crushing silence. But no answer came. Only the distant sound of water dripping somewhere in the prison's bowels, and the echo of my own desperate questions off the stone walls, which seemed to mock my insignificance. The night dragged on, a bottomless pit of darkness and divine silence. It was some time before dawn, at the peak of my despair, that something shifted. It wasn't an audible voice or a heavenly vision. It was more subtle, an almost imperceptible change in the atmosphere of the cell. Amidst God's silence, I began to feel not an answer, but a presence. I remembered the words of a psalm my grandfather had taught me to whisper in the dark as a child. Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. In that moment, the words ceased to be just ink on an ancient page and became the most real thing in the world. The promise wasn't of rescue. It wasn't of escape. The promise was of companionship. The realization hit me with a quiet force. I was going to die, but I would not die alone. The fear didn't vanish, but it lost its paralyzing power. A strange, deep calm settled over me, a peace that made no sense, an anchor that dug into the floor of my soul amidst the raging storm. I was still condemned, but I was no longer abandoned. For the next 3 days, I lived in this state of precarious calm. I prayed, but my prayers were no longer pleas for deliverance. They were conversations. I forgave Hamid, the young man who betrayed us, not because he deserved it, but because I needed to rid myself of the poison of resentment before I died. I prayed for my mother, my brothers, and my sister, asking God to protect them and give them strength. I prayed for the believers I left behind, that their faith would not waver, and I prayed for the other men in my cell. There were 3 of them, an old man who had been there for years, imprisoned for some forgotten political offense, and 2 younger men, common thieves. At first, they ignored me. A religious prisoner, the old man told me with a grunt, was the lowest caste, but my calmness intrigued them. On the 3rd night, One of the younger ones whispered through the darkness, his voice filled with a genuine, world-weary curiosity. "What's so important about this Jesus that you're willing to die for him?" The question hung in the musty air, a seed planted in the deepest darkness, an unexpected opportunity to bear witness on death row. On the morning of the fourth day, the appointed day, the sound of boots in the hallway stopped in front of my cell. The key turned in the lock with a metallic click that seemed to resonate in my bones. I felt no panic, just a deep resignation. The guards entered, their faces impassive. They pulled me up, tied my hands tightly behind my back with a rough rope that scraped my skin, and pushed me out. We climbed the stairs, emerging from the damp darkness into the blinding light of the morning sun. I had to squint. The brightness was a physical pain after days in the gloom. The prison courtyard was full. A crowd had gathered, curious and indifferent faces, all there to watch a man die. The law required people to attend, a public lesson on the consequences of disobedience. I looked for my family, praying they weren't there, that they wouldn't be forced to witness this. I didn't see their faces, a small, bitter relief in the midst of my end. In the center of the courtyard, a wooden post, thick and weathered, waited for me. This was it. The walk to the post seemed to last an eternity, and the blink of an eye all at once. My legs moved, but I didn't feel them as my own. It was as if my body were just following a script that had already been written, while my mind floated above it all, a distant observer. Each step kicked up a small cloud of dust. The murmur of the crowd was a low hum, like insects. We reached the post. I felt the rough, splintered wood against my back as they tied me to it, the ropes tightening around my chest so hard I could barely breathe. I tilted my head back and looked up at the cloudless blue sky. A final peace enveloped me. I was ready. I had made peace with God and with myself. I closed my eyes, waiting for the sound of the shot, the strike of the blade, whatever they had planned. I whispered Jesus' name one last time, not as a request, but as a declaration. It was the end of my story, and I accepted it. Then a shout cut through the air. It wasn't a cry of pain, but of authority. I opened my eyes. A man, a commander in an impeccable uniform I had never seen before, was striding across the courtyard, shouting orders. Everything stopped. The executioner, who was already taking his position, froze. The guards holding me looked on, confused. The commander reached the small group of officers overseeing the execution and began arguing with them, gesturing angrily at a folder of papers he was holding. I couldn't hear the words, only the furious tone of his voice. I saw the other officers shaking their heads, then looking at the papers, their faces shifting from certainty to confusion and frustration. The crowd began to murmur louder, sensing that something was wrong. What had been an efficient, grim ceremony of death had turned into a scene of bureaucratic chaos. The air crackled with a different tension now, not of imminent death, but of inexplicable disorder. After several minutes of heated discussion, the commander turned to the crowd and made a short, sharp announcement. The execution was postponed. There had been an administrative error, he said. The paperwork had not been filed correctly through the proper channels. It would be rescheduled for 48 hours from now. A murmur of disappointment and confusion swept through the crowd as they began to disperse. I was untied from the post, my legs trembling with delayed relief, and led back down the stairs into the darkness of my cell. The metal door slammed shut with a thud, and I sat down on the stone floor, trying to process what had just happened. It made no sense. Administrative errors didn't happen at executions. The old man in the cell with me, who had watched dozens of men be led to that courtyard, spoke from the darkness, his voice hoarse with disbelief. He said he had been in that prison for 3 years. He said that never, in all that time, had he seen an execution postponed. Never. And in those words, I felt a chill. It wasn't an error. It was something else. Those 2 days were perhaps harder than the original wait. Before, I had found peace in the acceptance of death. Now, an impossible seed of hope had been planted, and it was a painful seed. Every sound in the hallway made me jump. Every change of the guard's shift was a potential harbinger. I tried to pray, but my mind was torn between resignation and the frantic question, "What is happening?" The other men in the cell watched me differently. Contempt had been replaced by a cautious, almost fearful curiosity. I was no longer just the condemned apostate. I was the man whose execution had failed. The old prisoner didn't speak to me, but I would catch him staring at me from the darkness, his eyes trying to solve a puzzle that had no logical solution. The food they gave us tasted like ash. The water didn't quench my thirst. I was living in a suspended space between life and death, and the uncertainty was a form of torture more subtle, but just as cruel, as anything the guards could do. Hope, I discovered, can be far heavier than despair. The next morning, they came again. Same time, same routine, same heavy boots stopping at my door. This time, there was a different tension in the guards, an irritation, a determination that the job would be done without any more embarrassing interruptions. When they led me into the courtyard, the crowd was even larger. News of the postponement had spread like wildfire, drawing the curious. They were no longer here just to see an execution, but to see if the strange event would repeat itself. I was tied to the post for the second time. The ropes felt tighter, the wood rougher, the sun seemed hotter. I tried to find that peace I had felt before, but it eluded me. The seed of hope was fighting against acceptance, creating a tumult in my soul. I looked at the commander's face, hard and unyielding, and at the new executioner he had appointed, a man with cold eyes that would not waver. This time, I thought, there will be no mistakes. This time is the end. I closed my eyes and braced myself, my heart hammering against my ribs. Everything was ready. The officers were in place. The executioner raised his weapon. A heavy silence fell over the courtyard, and, once again, the impossible happened. A messenger came running into the courtyard, breathless, waving a piece of paper. He ran to the commander, panting, explaining that the truck transporting the additional religious authorities, whose presence was mandatory to validate the execution, had broken down on the way. The commander swore under his breath, his face turning red with anger. He yelled orders into his radio, demanding to know why they couldn't just fix the vehicle. The response that came back, audible to everyone nearby, was that the mechanics couldn't find the problem. It was a new vehicle, perfectly maintained, but it simply wouldn't start. By this point, even if they managed to get another transport, the time stipulated by Islamic law for the execution that day would have already passed. They had missed their window of opportunity. The absurdity of the situation was palpable. A divine farce being played out on a stage of death. I was untied and led back to the cell for the second time. The clang of the iron door sounded different this time. It wasn't a sound of finality, but of bewilderment. When I sat down, the other prisoners moved away from me, as if I carried some strange, dangerous energy. The silence lasted a long time, until one of the younger thieves spoke, his voice trembling. "What are you?" he asked, not with mockery, but with genuine fear. "Did you curse them? Are you some kind of sorcerer?" I looked at him in the dim light, and for the first time since I was condemned, the words came with clarity and strength. "I am nothing," I said, my voice sounding steadier than I felt, "but the God I serve is everything. It is not a curse that stops them. It is His hand." They didn't reply, but I knew they had heard. In that moment, my cell was no longer just a cell. It had become a place of witness, and the darkness was watching a light that refused to be extinguished. The third attempt was marked by an aura of contained fury. The humiliation of the two previous failures had spread, and the Taliban leadership could not allow their authority to be undermined by what some were already whispering was a miracle. This time, there would be no mistakes, No broken-down trucks, no lost paperwork. They brought in a new executioner, a man from outside the city, known for his cruelty and for having a heart of stone, immune to superstitions or nerves. When they led me into the courtyard for the third time, the crowd was in absolute silence. There were no more murmurs, just thousands of eyes fixed on me, waiting to see which force would prevail, that of the regime, or that of the invisible God who seemed to be protecting me. The guards pushed me with unnecessary brutality, their frustration evident in every touch. I felt the weight of every gaze, the expectation, the fear, the hope. They tied me to the post with grim efficiency. This time, there was no hesitation. The air was heavy, still, as if time itself were holding its breath. The new executioner approached. He was a large man, with a thick beard and eyes that held nothing but a cold emptiness. He didn't look at the crowd or the officers. His eyes locked onto mine, a tactic to intimidate, to dehumanize his target. He raised his rifle, the movement fluid and practiced. The metal of the gun glinted in the strong sun. I stared back at him, not with defiance, but with the peace that had returned to me, the certainty that my fate was not in this man's hands. And it was in that moment, as our eyes met, that it happened. His face changed. The emptiness in his eyes was suddenly filled with an abject, primordial terror. His skin lost its color, turning pale and waxy. His hands, which had held the gun with deadly firmness, began to tremble violently. The rifle slipped from his loose grip, clattering onto the stones of the courtyard with a loud metallic noise that shattered the tense silence, sounding like a decree. The executioner took a step back, then another, stumbling over his own feet. He continued to back away, shaking his head, his lips moving in inaudible words, his eyes still fixed on a point just behind me. The commander, in disbelief, exploded in a fit of rage. He ran to the executioner, shouting in his face, demanding to know what he was doing, ordering him to pick up the gun and finish the job. But the man seemed not to hear him. He was in a state of shock, completely broken, pointing at the empty space behind me and babbling a single phrase repeatedly, which I was later told was, "I can't. Don't you see?" The scene was one of absolute chaos. The crowd went into an uproar. The execution, for the third time, had disintegrated into a spectacle of inexplicable failure. The commander, utterly humiliated, shouted orders for me to be taken away, his authority crumbling before hundreds of witnesses. This time, the return to the cell was different. The guards didn't touch me. They walked at a respectful distance, one in front and one behind, as if they were escorting not a prisoner, but something they couldn't understand and deeply feared. When the cell door closed, the thud finalized the chapter. My cellmates were huddled in the opposite corner, as far away from me as possible. The fear in their eyes was different now. It was not the fear of a regime, but a reverential fear, the kind of fear one has in the face of the supernatural. From that day on, the guards stopped entering my cell. Food was pushed under the door. They no longer looked in my direction. I had become a ghost within the prison, a living anomaly that had broken the logic of their world. And I understood with absolute clarity that something impossible was indeed happening. God was intervening, not in subtle ways, but in ways so obvious and undeniable that even my enemies were forced to retreat, terrified and confused. The execution attempts stopped. The weeks turned into a month, and I continued to exist in that limbo. A prisoner, the prison didn't know how to kill. The dynamic inside my cell changed completely. The other prisoners' fear gave way to a desperate search for answers. The younger man, the thief, who had once asked me about Jesus, now asked questions every night. He wanted to know about forgiveness, about grace, about a God who could make executioners tremble. I began to teach them what I knew, reciting scriptures from memory in the darkness. Our cell became a secret church, a sanctuary in the heart of enemy territory. I told them stories of David, of Daniel, of Paul and Silas singing praises in prison. For the first time, those stories weren't just ancient tales to me. They were survival manuals, scripts for faith under fire. They listened with a hungry intensity, absorbing every word like a thirsty man drinks water. The light that refused to go out in the courtyard was now beginning to shine within the prison walls themselves. The most profound transformation happened in one of the men I least expected. One of the prisoners was a former Taliban soldier, imprisoned for some kind of insubordination. He had been the most skeptical, the most hostile at the beginning, but after the third failed execution, he fell silent for days. Then, one night, he began to cry. They were silent, shattering sobs of a broken man. He told me he had spent his whole life serving an idea of God that was about power, fear, and punishment. He had killed in the name of this God. He had tortured in the name of this God. But the God he was seeing in action, the God who could stop an execution with a look, seemed to operate from a completely different strength. He asked me questions about love, about mercy, and that night, in that filthy, hopeless place, a Taliban soldier gave his life to Jesus. He prayed with me, renouncing everything he had known, and a peace he had never experienced before enveloped him. I baptized him right there, with a little of our precious drinking water, a sacred act performed in the shadows of death. As faith grew in our cell, confusion and frustration mounted among our captors. 6 attempts in total were planned, and 6 times something stopped them. Once, a sudden and violent sandstorm appeared out of nowhere, minutes before the scheduled time, making visibility impossible. Another time, a high-ranking officer who needed to sign the final order fell mysteriously ill with a fever that disappeared the next day. Each failure was more bizarre than the last. The story of the cursed or protected prisoner spread throughout the prison and the city. The guards were afraid of me. The local leadership was paralyzed. Killing me seemed impossible, but freeing me would be an admission of defeat, an acknowledgement that there was a power greater than theirs, something their pride would never allow. They couldn't kill me, and they couldn't release me, so they left me to rot, hoping, perhaps, that the problem would simply go away. Then, after nearly 2 months of stalemate, the news came through a guard who sometimes talked to us out of pity or boredom. The leadership in Kandahar had been informed of the embarrassing situation. They were furious. They considered the local failure a disgrace, and they were sending a man to solve the problem. A man known to have no superstitions, no patience, and no mercy. An execution specialist who would not be deterred by terrified generals, sandstorms, or bureaucracy. He would arrive in 5 days. When he arrived, there would be no more postponements, no more interruptions. This time, it would be final. The guard told us this with a tone of grim finality, as if he were announcing the end of the world. And that night, the seed of hope that had sprouted in me withered. It seemed God had only given me more time, but the final outcome would be the same. The clock was ticking again, and this time, it felt like there would be no miracles to save me. That night, I couldn't sleep. The fear returned with an overwhelming force, different from before. It was a cold, calculated fear. If the previous interventions had been the hand of God, the arrival of this man from Kandahar felt like the end of the game, the checkmate. I spoke with God in the darkness, no longer with anger, but with a deep exhaustion. I thanked him for the extra time he had given me, time that allowed a Taliban soldier to find redemption. I asked that if my death was inevitable, that he use it to strengthen the faith of others. I surrendered, not with peace, but with the exhaustion of a soldier who had fought to the end and had no strength left. Sometime in the middle of the night, I fell into a restless sleep and dreamed. In the dream, I was standing in my cell, but the walls were not solid. They were like smoke or water. translucent. A voice, coming from nowhere and everywhere, spoke words I knew but had never understood so deeply. Whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. And in the dream, I simply walked forward and passed through the walls as if they weren't there. I woke up with my heart pounding in my chest. The cell was still dark and solid, the walls still cold stone, but something inside me had shifted. The dream, or whatever it was, had implanted not a vague hope, but an absolute, inexplicable certainty. I was going to escape. I didn't know how. I didn't know when, but I knew it would happen. From that moment on, I stopped being a passive prisoner waiting for death or rescue. I became an active observer, a soldier awaiting the order to advance. I started paying attention to everything. The times of the guard changes, at 6 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and 10 at night. The 15-minute period of chaos and disarray during each change. The specific sound of each door. The creak of hinges. The click of locks. I noticed that sometimes, in the rush of the changeover, the guards didn't turn the key to our cell completely. The door would be closed, but not locked. I wasn't planning an escape. I was preparing for one. Khaled, the converted soldier, noticed the change in me. He saw the alertness in my eyes, the way I now measured and memorized our surroundings. He asked me what had happened. I told him about the dream, about the certainty I felt. He listened intently, then nodded slowly, his face serious. "When the time comes," he said in a whisper, "do not hesitate, do not look back, just run." I asked him what would happen to him and the others when they discovered my escape. He smiled, a sad smile filled with a peace that transcended that place. "The door opened for you, Rashid, not for us. My purpose is here. Yours is out there. If you don't go when God tells you to go, you will be rejecting the miracle." His words freed me from the weight of guilt, from the loyalty that could have kept me chained. He was giving me permission to survive, commissioning me for the next phase of my journey, whatever it might be. On the night of the 4th day, one day before the executioner from Kandahar was due to arrive, an unusual commotion took over the prison. We heard shouts, hurried footsteps on the upper levels. At 10 o'clock, the shift change was more chaotic than usual. We heard the guards arguing, complaining about being short-staffed, about someone who hadn't shown up. Khaled and I exchanged a look in the darkness. The disorder, the confusion, it was a pattern we were learning to recognize. And then, around 11, the lights went out. Not just the bulb in our hallway, but all the lights in the prison. The darkness was total, absolute, as if the world itself had been extinguished. We heard shouts and curses from the floors above. The emergency generator, which should have kicked in within seconds, remained silent. In the midst of the chaos and darkness, I stood up, my heart beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I went to the bars of the door. I pushed, and it opened. I was paralyzed for a second, the air frozen in my lungs, unable to believe what had just happened. The door was open. The darkness and chaos were my cover. Behind me, Khaled grabbed my arm, his hand squeezing with a fierce urgency. "Go," he whispered, his voice a whip in the silence. "Go now. This is your miracle. Don't waste it." I turned to him in the darkness, my mind reeling. "And you? What about them? This door opened for you, not for us," he said, his voice firm, making it clear there was no room for argument. "Our purpose is here. Yours is out there. Now go, before the lights come back on." I hesitated for one more heartbeat. Then I hugged him quickly, feeling his thin frame, knowing I might never see him again. "You are a shepherd now," I whispered in his ear. "Lead them. Teach them. Keep the light burning." "I will," he promised. "Now run." I pulled away, and, as I passed through the doorway, I heard the old prisoner's voice, clear and calm in the darkness. "May your God go with you." I stepped out into the hallway, into the total darkness, into the unknown. I placed my hand on the cold, damp wall to guide myself and began to walk, counting each step as I had practiced in my mind. 23 steps to the turn. I moved as quickly as I dared, my heart pounding wildly, each step an act of blind faith. Above me, the guards were still shouting, their voices echoing down the stairwells, all focused on fixing the generator, on restoring order. No one thinking to check the cells on the lowest level. They were my greatest danger, but their distraction was my shield. I reached the turn and went left. 18 more steps to the stairs. The darkness was so complete I couldn't see a thing, moving purely by memory and touch. My foot found the first step. I began to climb. 42 steps. I counted them one by one, my hand sliding along the wall, climbing towards the voices, towards the danger, towards freedom. At the top, the voices were dangerously close. 2, maybe 3 guards were just around the corner of the hallway, less than 10 meters away. Their shouts were clear now. They were arguing about who was responsible for maintenance, who would be blamed for the failure. I could smell the cigarette smoke from one of them. To freeze meant being discovered. To turn back was impossible. I felt in my spirit that I had to keep going, that I couldn't wait, that God was covering me somehow. I took a step off the staircase and began to walk down the hall, towards them. It was the most insane act of my life. I could hear them clearly, so close I could have reached out and touched them. They continued to argue, their backs to me, their voices loud with anger and frustration. I walked past them in the darkness. They never turned. They never looked. They never saw me. By the time I passed them, my legs were shaking so badly I could barely walk. But I kept going, one step at a time, praying with every breath, Jesus, Jesus, Jesus. Then I saw moonlight ahead, a silver glow spilling through an opening. It was the door to the courtyard. I stepped out into the open air, and the moonlight seemed impossibly bright after weeks underground. The courtyard was completely empty. No guards, no patrols. I would later learn that a false bomb threat had been called in to the prison, drawing most of the guards to the outer perimeter. But in that moment, all I knew was that the courtyard, where they had tried to kill me 6 times, was silent and empty before me. I crossed the 50 meters of open ground, expecting a shot at any second. Nothing. I reached the outer gate, the gate that should have been locked and guarded at all times. It was ajar, just a crack, wide enough for a person to slip through. The wind, they said later, must have blown it open during the confusion. But I knew it wasn't the wind. It was the same hand that had opened my cell door. I slid through the opening and found myself on the street outside the prison walls. Free, but I was in the middle of enemy territory, wearing prisoner's clothes, and the alarm would soon be raised. For a moment, I just stood there, unable to move, breathing the cold, free night air. Reality then hit me like a physical blow. I was not safe, not even close. I was an escaped prisoner in the middle of Taliban-controlled territory, wearing the clothes that marked me as one. Soon, maybe in hours, maybe in minutes, they would discover I was gone. The alarm would sound. The hunt would begin. I started walking, fast, trying to look purposeful, but not panicked. The streets were mostly deserted because of the curfew. I kept to the shadows, my entire body an exposed nerve jumping at every distant sound, every car headlight that turned a corner. There was only one destination in my mind, a single fragile hope of refuge. Brother Mahmoud's tea shop, on the other side of the city. It was 6 kilometers away. At that moment, it felt like the distance from the earth to the moon, an impossible journey through a minefield of dangers. That walk was the longest of my life. I moved from one dark space to another, my heart hammering in my chest with every passing vehicle. At one point, a Taliban truck slowed as it passed me. I pressed myself against a dark doorway, holding my breath, certain they had seen me. The faces inside the cab scanned me for a second that lasted an eternity. Then they turned away, and the truck sped up. My clothes were soaked with cold sweat. My hands shook uncontrollably. Every corner I turned, I expected to find a patrol. Every dark alley I entered could be a trap. I prayed continuously, no longer with words, but with a silent, desperate groan in my spirit, asking God to keep me invisible, not to let this miracle end with a recapture just blocks from freedom. Finally, after what felt like a lifetime, I saw the familiar shape of Brother Mahmoud's shop. It was dark, closed for the night. I went around to the back alley, my heart in my throat, and went to the door that few people knew about. I knocked, using our old emergency signal. 3 quick knocks, a pause, 2 knocks, a pause, 1 knock. I waited. Nothing. Panic began to rise in my throat. What if I had the code wrong? What if he wasn't there? What if he had been arrested? I knocked again, harder, desperation starting to take hold. If he didn't answer, I had nowhere to go. The door opened a crack. Brother Mahmoud's eye appeared in the space, suspicious and wary. Then recognition hit him. The door swung open. He grabbed me by the arm and pulled me inside so fast I almost fell, locking it behind me. He stared at me in the dim light of his storeroom, his eyes wide, as if he were seeing a ghost. "It's not possible," he whispered, his voice thick with shock. They said the execution was tomorrow. How are you here?" "God opened the doors," I said, my voice a tremor I could barely control. "All of them. The cell, the gates, everything." He continued to stare at me, then his practical nature took over. He made me sit, brought me water and bread. I hadn't realized how hungry and dehydrated I was. My hands were shaking so much I could barely hold the cup. As I ate, he began to make phone calls, speaking in coded language, careful and quick. Within minutes, he hung up and looked at me, his face serious. "They will turn the city upside down when they find out," he said. "You can't stay here. You can't even stay in Afghanistan. We need to get you out of the country, and we need to do it before dawn." Brother Mahmoud then told me something that made my heart stop and start again. When he first heard about my scheduled execution, he began to prepare for the impossible. Believing a miracle could happen, he had, risking everything, contacted my family. He gathered them, moving them from our home to a safe location, the house of Sister Fatima, a widow in our network, so they wouldn't be caught in the retaliation that would surely follow my execution or escape. They were there, waiting. "I thought you might want to say goodbye," Brother Mahmoud said quietly. I couldn't speak. The tears I hadn't cried since the first night in the cell came silently, streaming down my face. The thought of seeing them, of touching them one last time, was a pain and a joy so intense it nearly broke me in two. We had to move immediately. Time was running out. We left his shop into the darkness, 2 ghosts gliding through a sleeping city that would soon awaken to hunt me. Brother Mahmoud walked about 20 meters ahead of me, a silent scout, his body tense, alert for any sign of patrols. I followed, keeping to the deepest shadows, moving from doorway to doorway, alley to alley. Every noise was a threat, every distant headlight a harbinger of capture. It took us nearly an hour to cross the city to Sister Fatima's small house on the edge, where the city frayed into fields. She was waiting, watching from the window. The door opened before we even knocked. She pulled us inside quickly, and there they were, my family, my entire world, gathered in one small, dimly lit room. Their faces were a mixture of shock, terror, and a relief so profound it was almost violent. My mother saw me, and her legs gave out. My brothers caught her. Then they rushed to me, and we embraced, a tangle of arms and tears, trying to muffle the sobs so as not to alert the neighbors. I had maybe 15 minutes to say goodbye to a lifetime. My mother held my face in her hands, her thumbs tracing my cheeks, my thin beard, as if to confirm I was real. that I was flesh and blood. She kept whispering, "You are alive, alive, alive." I asked her for forgiveness, for all the pain, for all the danger. She shook her head fiercely. "You followed Jesus," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "How can a mother be angry at that?" But then the pain of reality hit her, the understanding that this release meant a departure, perhaps forever. The joy of having her son back, and the agony of losing him again, all in the same instant. I turned to my brothers and my sister. I told them to be wise, to be careful, keep the faith in their hearts, but quietly, like buried seeds waiting for spring. I told them to live, to marry, to have children, to survive. My youngest sister cried silently, her tears leaving tracks on her dusty face. She asked me when I would come back, and the question hung between us, unanswered, because the truth was, I didn't know if I ever would. Shortly before 3 in the morning, an old, battered truck pulled up outside. The smuggler. It was time to go. My mother placed her hands on my head and blessed me in a feverish whisper. I hugged each of my brothers. My sister clung to me until someone gently pulled her away. Then I climbed into the back of that truck, into a dark, cramped false compartment, the panel closing over me, sealing in the darkness, and separating me from everything I had ever known and loved. The world became darkness, the smell of diesel, and the fear of strangers. There were 2 other people in that tight space, a young couple fleeing their own persecution. We could barely move. Every jolt of the truck on the potholed road threw us against each other. The air grew hot and thin, heavy with our ragged breathing. Time lost all meaning. Hours passed in a daze, suspended between the hope of escape and the terror of a checkpoint. We stopped several times. I heard the muffled voices of guards outside, the sound of papers being exchanged, the thud of a fist on the metal side of the truck, testing its solidity. At each stop, the silence inside our compartment was absolute. We held our breath, each of us praying to our own God, transformed into a single entity, united by fear. The driver must have paid the right bribes, because each time, after a tense eternity, the truck would start moving again, carrying us further from death and towards a future I couldn't even imagine. After countless hours, the truck stopped and the panel was opened. The gray light of dawn hit us like a blow. We were in a desolate, mountainous area near the border. The driver told us to get out and pointed to a young guide who was waiting for us. We would have to cross on foot. The climb was brutal. My muscles, atrophied from weeks in the cell and hours in the truck, screamed in protest. The mountain air was thin and sharp. The refugee couple struggled as much as I did. We climbed in silence, stumbling on loose rocks, our lungs burning. At one point, the guide pushed us to the ground. Below us, on a parallel track, we saw the lights of a patrol. We lay flat, our faces pressed against the cold earth. As the voices and lights passed, so close I could feel the vibration of their steps. When they were gone, we continued. At the top of the ridge, I stopped and looked back. I could see the distant lights of my city, my home, my life, my prison. It was all there, under the same sky, but in a different universe. I turned and didn't look back again. We descended to the other side, into another country, into another life. The guide left us in a small village, at a house belonging to a refugee aid network. The moment I crossed the threshold of that door, the moment the door closed behind me, and I knew with a certainty that settled in my bones that I was out of their reach. My legs gave out. I simply collapsed onto the floor, not unconscious, but completely drained of all the strength, all the adrenaline, all the faith that had kept me going. Everything that had sustained me through the imprisonment, the failed executions, the escape, the journey, simply dissolved, leaving me an empty shell on the dirt floor. I didn't cry. I didn't pray. I couldn't form a single thought. I just lay there, feeling the solid ground beneath me, the first safe place in an eternity. and the only thing I could feel was the crushing weight of having survived. That was many years ago. I have a new name. I live in a new country. I never saw my family again. I don't know what happened to Khalid or the other men in that cell. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, I try to find a logic to it all. I try to connect the dots, to find the grander plan, the theological reason for unlocked doors and terrified executioners. But I can't. The experience didn't leave me with answers. It left me with a mark, a scar on my soul that throbs with the memory of the impossible. It wasn't a lesson. It was an event. It happened, and then it stopped, as abruptly as it began. I don't understand why I was spared. I don't know why the laws of nature and probability seemed to bend for a few months in a God-forsaken prison. All I know is that for a brief moment, the hand of something incomprehensible touched my world, and ever since, nothing has ever made complete sense again. Rashid's journey shows us that faith moves the impossible. And now, I want to ask you, what was the moment when God's hand manifested so clearly in your life that it was impossible to deny? Leave your experience here in the comments. Your testimony might be exactly what someone else needs to read today to keep believing. So you don't miss transformative content like this, which strengthens our souls. Subscribe to the channel now and activate the bell for all notifications. It's your guarantee that we will never be disconnected. If you feel in your heart the desire to support our ministry, but don't know how, you can make a difference. And don't go away. The video appearing on your screen now is our special recommendation for you. Click on it and continue this journey of faith with us. A big hug, stay with God, and see you in the next video.